Um, I'm Kyrie O'Connor, class of 76, a recently retired journalist, and I'm here talking with Theodore Shaw, Ted, who is, now correct me if I'm wrong, Ted, Julius L. Chambers Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of North Carolina, Director of the University of North Carolina Center for Civil Rights, a longtime Director and President of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, Wesleyan Board of Trustees member for 15 years, and possessor of the Baldwin Medal from Wesleyan. I'm sure my Baldwin Medal is just kind of like stuck at the post office, but but did I get that right, Ted?
You got it right. Although one massage is that I was a longtime lawyer at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and then associate director counsel, and then director counsel. But I spent much more time practicing as one of the Legal Defense Fund lawyers than I did running the Legal Defense Fund.
Cool.
But otherwise, that's all correct. Now, where have you been? A journalist. What kind of journalism did you do?
Newspaper and online, and a little bit of radio. I stayed in Connecticut after graduating, and eventually wound up at the Hartford Courant.
Okay.
Where I was an assistant managing editor.
Okay. All right.
And then
go ahead.
2003, I took a flying leap and went and took a job as a deputy managing editor at the Houston Chronicle in Texas.
Oh, okay. All right. Current and the Houston Chronicle are papers I know well, and over the years have done interviews with them and read them. So, two fine papers.
They were fine papers.
Yeah, and in this day and age, I know it's a challenge to run a newspaper. And I'm embarrassed to ask this, and you'll tell me whether I should be embarrassed. We're the same class at Wesleyan. Did we know each other then?
No, we didn't know each other at all.
I didn't think so. I did not think so. And I think of Wesleyan as being a pretty small university. But I guess our paths just didn't cross.
Well, I'll have to tell you a funny story about that. About a year or two ago, my sister went to some sort of dinner or something where you spoke. And she was incredibly impressed. And she called me up and she said, well, this Ted Shaw, who was from your class at Wesleyan. And I said, well, I didn't know him.
You said, never heard of him.
I'd heard of you, but I didn't know you. And she just kept saying your name like very slowly, like you would for, like you didn't know Ted Shaw. Nope, sorry. Ran with a different crowd.
Yeah. Well, you tell him, no, I didn't know him. And that's that, and he didn't know me either. So I'm glad to meet you finally, all these years later.
Never too late.
That's right. 45 years, my goodness.
Well, okay, now this is a question I actually have for you. If you scroll back 45 years, so you're like young Ted.
Yeah, I can't remember that, but go ahead.
Now, when you were leaving Wesleyan, is this the path you thought you would take?
Actually, and before I answer that, let me just say, yeah, it's 45 years. That's since we graduated. It's been 40, what is it? 49 years since we first came to campus. It's hard to process that, to comprehend that, because I don't know about you, but I never thought that I would get to be this old, and here we are, and I'm glad to be here.
I never thought I'd get to be this old and still have my teeth.
Well, we won't talk about teeth because I have teeth. They're mine now, but some of them I paid for. So let me answer your question. this way. Um, I uh, I pretty much knew what I wanted to do. Now, that doesn't mean I really had an idea about how to get there, but I knew I wanted to be a civil rights lawyer, even when we graduated from Wesleyan. I wrote a senior thesis. I was in CSS on the civil rights movement. Um, I had read about it and studied about it. And as far as I was concerned, it was the most important thing that was going on in our time. I was a child of the civil rights movement and the civil rights era. So my answer is that yes, I knew what I wanted to do, but that certainly did not mean that I would get there.
From the outside, it looks like a fairly straight path. It probably didn't feel like that from where you were.
Yes and no. Even then, and I'm blessed to be able to say this. I knew that there were two places that would be my dream job. Uh, One would be the Justice Department, the Civil Rights Division. That was the first job I held. And the other was the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, the organization that Thurgood Marshall founded, and he was the first director counsel. And it was my dream to work there. Somewhere around that time, there was a book written by an author, Richard Kluger. So Richard Kluger wrote Simple Justice, which was a story about Brown versus Board of Education and everything that led up to it. It's a wonderfully written book, even all these years later. And I read it when it was published. It was somewhere around that time. And it had a big influence on me, but I already had a sense of what I wanted to do.
But it's been 45 years, and the issues of civil rights, I mean, has it gotten better? Is it better? Is it gonna get better? Is this just like the original sin that never goes away?
Well, I'll give you a lawyer's answer.
Sure.
Yes and no. The the country has gotten better in profound ways. I mean, when we were graduating from Wesleyan, it was not within the scope of my vision that we would see an African American president of the United States. Now, we've seen one elected twice, and we could talk about that, but it hasn't meant quite everything that we might have thought it could have meant. And I don't mean to understate the significance of it, because it is significant. It does tell us something about the way the country has changed. But I think you just referred to race and racism as the original sin of this country. And I agree with that, with the qualification, of course, that the genocide against Native American people, indigenous people, was original sin, but certainly slavery and racism has been this country's greatest long-lasting dilemma. And there are many people who have long wanted to deny that and sweep it under the rug. And yet, periodically, it becomes impossible to do that. It rears its head. And we still have not resolved the issues of the legacy of slavery and racism, including contemporary racism. Did we ever think in 2021 we would see an insurrection and an assault on the Capitol of the United States, largely driven by white supremacists? No, I wouldn't have thought that. But at the same time, I've never been one of these people who have thought that we become a colorblind society and we put race behind us. It's always been clear to me that as much as we might want to get there, that we're not there yet. In spite of President Obama's election twice.
Yeah, well, there was that 90 seconds back in 2008 where everyone was saying post-racial.
Yeah, well, some people were saying it before then. Being engaged in the work I did, I was long used to having debates and conflicts inside of courtrooms and outside of courtrooms with conservatives who wanted to use that term post-racial. Yes, after the election of President Obama, there were even more people who said we were post-racial. The great irony, of course, is that we've seen a resurgence in racism, not merely in spite of the election of President Obama twice, but in significant ways, profoundly because of the election of President Obama. And I say that before we get to the point where we're post-racial, we have to pass through a time when we are post-racist. And that hasn't happened. We're not there yet. I don't know that it will happen in my lifetime, but we can hope for it. We can continue to fight for that. Although I add that post-racial, if we ever get there, doesn't mean colorblind to me. That term has been hijacked by some people to mean something that I think still reflects a failure to understand the significance of race in this country. Awareness of race is not the same thing as racism, although many people try to equate those two things. And so when people say, I don't see race and I don't see color, I say you're kind of distorting the significance of what it is we ought to be trying to achieve. The question isn't whether you see it. The question is, what is its significance? So we've long been engaged in these kinds of discussions, these debates, and these discourses with many people believing that we would get to a point where we wouldn't be thinking about issues of race, much less seeing them.
Well, when I was researching you, I came across a speech that you made in Charlottesville, I believe about a year after the incidents in Charlottesville. And one of the things you talked about was this experience that's like really common for our generation, but I think you had a very different experience than I did, which is looking up your ancestry.
Americans could do that. Many European Americans could do it, or had a sense of what country their ancestors came from. For African Americans, and that terminology we need to unpack in and of itself. But for most of us, it was impossible to do that. Well, DNA has made it possible to do what we couldn't do before. And I'm very conscious, and I've come to the point where I talk about this more often than I used to. I'm very and I might have talked about this at Charlottesville rather. Apparently I did. I'm conscious of the fact that I sit here as a very light-skinned, as we say in the African-American community, African-American man who, according to our history in this country, with respect to issues of race, a little dab will do, drop, and you're identified as African American or Black, or pejorative terminology that used to be used. So I say that conscious of the fact that, as I say to my wife all the time, I'm a mud of a man. Um, you know, I am someone who has the blood of and the DNA of people who were enslaved. But um, just as that is part of who I am, and I think the part that I identify with the most, and at one time would have had no choice but to identify most with that. But similarly, I am also the descendant of enslavers who, uh, as was the case, you know, forced themselves on, raped women they enslaved. Uh, so it's complicated. Now the truth is that we're all many things. Some people have narratives about who and what their families are, but probably if they just do a little bit of DNA testing, they'll find out there are many things, and some of those things might surprise them. But I don't know if you've seen Skip Gates. Who do you
Yes.
think you are?
Mhm.
Uh, Skip is the one who started me on this path. You know, he asked me to take a DNA test. He was working with the National Geographic Genome Project, and I didn't know what he was asking for, but I did it. And as a consequence, he came back and they came back to me and they gave me some very generalized information about where my ancestors came from. We all start in Africa, and went from there. But I didn't have a lot of detail until much later. But he came back to me and said they want to do more testing, and they think you're related to a prominent family in Virginia. Uh, well, you know, I know that I had family from Virginia. Our maternal grandmother was from Charles City, Virginia, or rather, her family line was. She was born in New York and was a Harlemite all her life. Uh, and she would tell us things, and I wasn't sure whether they were accurate or not. But and that wasn't because she was a dishonest person, but uh, people, particularly Black folk, African Americans, in many ways, you know, we've been infected by the same kinds of racism that um, originate in white America that have been foisted upon Black folks. And so, you know, whether it's skin color, discrimination, which still exists within the Black community, or other forms of discrimination, that's a reality. But long story short, I took, you know, I did even more testing, and the family that they thought I was connected to turns out to be a white family who enslaved at least one of my ancestors. Uh, and it was uncomfortable at first, though I had conversations with them. But by now I've come to know them. It's still, to some degree anyway, it's still a developing relationship. I've had conversations I never thought I would have. And in fact, they're asking me now to be even more engaged in what is a family association that they have. I'm not saying everybody in that family would necessarily welcome me and other African American descendants from enslaved people, but the primary actors who lead this family association very much want to get me engaged in being part of it. And not only that, they want to identify other African Americans who are descended, and they want to have an honest conversation. One quick example is that uh, some of the members of this family were killed in the Nat Turner Rebellion.
Wow.
I thought that was very interesting. Um, but a couple of years ago, and I have not been to a family reunion in person yet, and I've only been to the last one, which was a Zoom family reunion. And it was in part because I found out that they had one of Nat Turner's descendants come and speak at one of their last in-person family reunions. And, here's a descendant of Nat Turner speaking to descendants of one of the families that was where people were killed during the rebellion. Well, that's a place where you talk about change. I think it represents some kind of change and the beginning of understandings about the complexities of who we are as an American people. That's a truly American story, as is the story of all of these complex relationships. I told one of the members of this family when we first had a conversation that got a little awkward. Look, nobody is responsible for what their ancestors did, nor are we really able to take credit for anything good they did. We're only responsible for what we do or fail to do in our time. To the extent that some people continue to believe in the stuff of white supremacy, they're responsible for that. Yes, I talked about that, I think, to some degree in Charlottesville, and I've begun to talk about it more often at this late stage of my life.
Well, see, Ted, this is what I mean. I looked up my ancestors. I found a lot of people who worked for the railroad.
For the railroad?
Yeah, it's not, it's not the same fraught experience. I didn't have to deal with a lot of the big questions in life.
Well, I say all families, we have, I've come to say, in-laws and outlaws in any family. Some people don't want to mess with this DNA stuff because they're vested in certain narratives about their ancestry, who they were, who they weren't. Sometimes you find out that, granddaddy or great granddaddy wasn't really your blood ancestor, or complex things like that. People don't want to talk about that. Well, I'm not too vested in any particular narrative, except to say that I know that the story of my ancestry is complicated.
Yeah, it is. And it's in a very peculiarly American way.
Yes, although I'll just add this too. I say this without hesitation. I proudly identify as an African American, even though I have a lot of other things in me. I started to wear a T-shirt today, not because of our interview. My wife gave it to me recently. I don't know where she got it from, but it says something like lightly melanated, hella black. And I love that shirt, and I think it captures something that I really feel. I'm proud to be a descendant from African American people, and some of them are among the first African Americans or the early African Americans who came involuntarily, but nonetheless came to Virginia, not far from Jamestown.
Okay, it's slightly different, but it's something I'm really curious about. Now, you've been before the Supreme Court, right?
I have.
What's that like?
By the time I argued before the Supreme Court, I had been litigated for many years. And I had argued many cases in the U.S. Courts of Appeal. And I have, experience in doing that. The difference between those cases is, you have another stop if you lose that you can go to, or if the other side loses, they can take you to the Supreme Court. It's the last stop. There are also 9 justices, and so there's some things mechanically about the Supreme Court. And I'm sure you weren't asking about this, but when you're arguing for the Supreme Court, you are you're standing at the lectern, and you're much closer to these justices than you would first anticipate. And so they are kind of concave, around you. And there's some mechanical things that happen. You get a question from this side, and you're answering that question, and then a voice pipes in over there. You have to turn on and do, and so you're actually being used by the justices to facilitate a conversation or an argument between them. And you want to make sure you don't mess up and concede something, give something away that it's going to hurt your client. But in some ways, you're being used by these justices in this argument. I love oral argument. Are you a little nervous? Yeah. Anybody who say they're not isn't being candid about it. But once you get up and start arguing, it's game time. And you have to forget about being nervous. You're in the moment. It's an honor. It's great in some ways, but in other ways, it's I'm not going to say it's not a big deal, but it's an experience that I don't know how to say it. You value that moment, but then you go on to the next case or the next cases and the other work that you have to do. I spend a lot of time, though, thinking about the Supreme Court, the justices, their decisions, and what they've been doing with the law, particularly with the 14th Amendment, but other constitutional provisions. And if you start me talking about that, it's quite garrulous. I know that's not what you're looking for, but I spend a lot of time thinking about the Supreme Court and what it has done. And I have a critique about it, but that's another story for another day for other people who want to hear it or not. When I found my way to Wesleyan in 1972, it was almost by accident. It was serendipitous. There was no guarantee I was going to go to college, much less go to a university that was the quality of Wesleyan University. And of course, our Wesleyan has changed in many ways. It was a different time, a different era. And I found my way there in ways that were quite accidental in some ways. I was very fortunate. And I loved my 4 years at Wesleyan. I didn't love everything about it. I had the, I don't know if I call it misfortune, but 2 other African-American men and I were the first to stay on the Wesleyan basketball team, and Wesleyan wasn't at that time much in the way of athletics, so it wasn't a big deal. But there had never been any Black players who had
That's
stayed
amazing.
on. Well, yeah, well, it was not only amazing. People used to come to the games and root for the other team, and a lot of it had to do with the racial divisions of that time. that's a painful set of experiences. I don't know that I would do it again if I was back at Wesleyan. It was a painful memory, a painful experience. Um, that was not one of my better experiences at Wesleyan, but we did it. You know, we didn't quit. We did it. And you know, my major program, CSS, that was a wonderful program. And I'm grateful all these years later for being able to have the educational experience I had in CSS. And I loved the other student activities that I was engaged in. I loved Wesleyan. When we graduated, the day we graduated, I don't know, I think you said that you're going to interview Jay Hogarth, who was my roommate. I don't know if you remember, but Jay, jazz musician, he played the vibes.
I do remember that.
Our graduation. Bob Thompson, my dear friend, who's a minister, has been the chaplain, was for many years up at Exeter. You know, he was our class president. But I felt like I was being cheated because I was being told unceremoniously, in effect, that it was time to go. You know, you have to leave this place. Just when I had figured out, you know, the best parts of it and how to live the best Wesleyan life I could live. I never dreamed, though, when we graduated from Wesleyan, that most of my engagement with Wesleyan, my relationship with Wesleyan, was in front of me and not behind me in those 4 years. The final thing I'll say is, over the years, I've had many students, high school students, come to me who want to attend Wesleyan. Sometimes I've been able to put in a word for them that's helpful, sometimes not. I got into Wesleyan off the wait list. I got into Columbia Law School off the wait list. I've come to say that I'm a wait list type of person. I tell my wife that if I'm blessed enough to make it to heaven, assuming there is one above, I'm not good enough to get in straight out, but maybe I'll get in
off the wait list.
So I was asking, what did you, whether you knew what you wanted to do when you graduated from Wesleyan? You said absolutely not.
I had no idea. I knew that I liked to write, and I knew that I didn't like academia.
Okay.
So that kind of narrowed it down right there. So back then journalism was actually, you know, thriving. So I went and found myself a job.
Did you go to journalism school?
Thank you for bringing that up, because it's one of the things I'm proudest of. I had a 40-year career in journalism, and I've never taken a journalism course. I still don't get what they teach in journalism courses.
So it came to you honestly.
Yes. Yes, I learned by being paid every week.
Well, that's a good way to learn. Did you have a good experience at Wesleyan? I mean, were you glad you came there? What was it? You know, what do you remember?
Yes, I did. I had a pretty good experience. I would take the blame for some of the things that didn't go particularly well. I think there were a couple of semesters there where I really could have studied. But other than that, I had a very good experience.
Yeah. So you never regretted Wesleyan. How did you find?
No. I'm very grateful to Wesleyan because, well, this is probably too much information, but my parents took me aside when I was about 16, and they said, "We don't have any money to send you to college. You're gonna have to figure this one out." So,
where were you? Where did you grow up?
Rochester, New York.
In Rochester. Okay. Yeah. I know I said recently in Rochester, I think about Rochester. Of course, everybody thinks about Kodak, understandably.
Mhm.
I think about Frederick Douglass.
Yes, exactly. Well, the first, the statue of Frederick Douglass in Rochester was the first statue of an African-American man in the United States.
Is that right?
Mhm.
Wow. Now there's a well-known one in Harlem at 110th Street and 8th Avenue. And it's a pretty good representation. If I can get to Rochester again, I want to visit and see that statue. He's not buried there anymore, if I remember correctly. I think he was at one point, and then they moved his
I
body.
think that might be right. I know Susan B. Anthony is still there. She's
Yeah.
still buried there.
Yeah. And so, how did you get to Wesleyan if your parents told you, we don't have any money, you figure this out? How'd you figure that
Well,
out?
I was a national merit semifinalist, which means you get a lot of stuff in the mail.
Mhm.
A lot of things stamped, special handling, and I got an application from Wesleyan in the mail, so I filled it out. And,
Okay.
And when I got my financial aid form, it was like, they're gonna give me what?
Yeah.
So at that point, it was like, yeah, I did it.
I hear you. Wesleyan at that time, if I remember correctly, and you'll probably remember this also, I think it was the wealthiest school per capita, for students in the country. Now, Wesleyan burned through a lot of that money not long after that.
Mhm.
We were students there, but it had a very generous financial aid capacity there, which sealed the deal for me once I
Me
was.
too. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm sorry that our paths didn't cross then. It was in some ways a big small college, and so there are a lot of people I didn't get to know.
Well, it was the kind of place too where they didn't offer, they wanted you going outwards rather than sort of coming inwards.
Yeah, true. That's a good way of describing it. So one last question that I'll ask of you. When we graduated on that day in 1976, what did you see yourself doing if you didn't have a career in journalism already in mind? And what were your thoughts about your Wesleyan experience as you left?
Well, I was full of hope, I guess, but I wound up scooping ice cream for most of that summer. I didn't fall into journalism right away, and I got a job on the cleaning crew at Wesleyan, and I cleaned the what was that called, the science building.
Science.
I cleaned that every night for many weeks.
Yeah. Well, the summer after I graduated from Wesleyan, after we graduated from Wesleyan, I had two jobs. My sister, a year older than me, who's with me now, Vivian was a disco queen for a number of years.
Ooh.
The smartest person in our family of all our siblings, but she worked at a club and got me a job working at nights at this club. But my job was, to be candid about it, because my kids' jaws drop when I talk about this now. I'm glad I did it. I had two jobs that summer. One was I worked at the Gap jeans in Greenwich Village, selling jeans and all of that. But the other job was working at this club. And, I was a busboy. Picking up drinks and, bringing the glasses in, washing them, and also cleaning the restrooms. And when my kids hear that. You did what? You cleaned toilets? Yes, that's what I did. Somebody's got to do it. And it's a good job for anyone to have, or a job like that at some point in their lives.
Oh, it's very important to clean toilets for part of your life because it gives you perspective.
That's right. That's right. And so that's what I did that summer. And it was a good summer. I played in about 2 or 3 basketball leagues. That was fun.
Wow.
Then it was off to start law school.
Okay, Ted. And
so there you go.
In conclusion, I have one question for you. Do you know the weird thing about you and me?
I have no idea. You're going to tell me.
Okay, then I'm going to reveal it to you. We were born on the same day.
Are you kidding me?
Nope.
November 24th, 1954.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that I've met anybody else born on the same day. The same, the date, November 24th, of course I have. But I don't know that I've met anybody else who.
You know who else? I don't know if you knew Stuart Coleman at Wesleyan. Yeah. He was also born the same day.
Is that right? Well, let me be presumptuous then. We need to talk some more. We share that. Maybe we're kindred spirits in some ways. But wow.
Yes.
What time of the day were you born?
Right after midnight.
Right after. Well, with all due respect, you're older than I am.
I am. I'm older than you are. I was afraid of that.
I was born at 8:51 in the morning. So it was that. All right. Well, thank you for sharing that.
My pleasure. It was nice talking to you.
Good talking to you, Kyrie. I wish you the best. I love the part of the country you're in.
Me too. Yes.
We don't get up there anymore. We used to go to Maine and vacation there, and I used to love trips through New England. I hope to get there again sometime.
I'm sure you will. Now's a good time.
It is. All right. Be well.
You too. Take care.